Welcome back, everyone. Today is going to be a fun one. Today I'm going to talk all about the masculine virtue of violent capability. Yes, you heard me correctly. No, I did not misspeak. The capacity for violence, the skill and ability to apply it at the right time, the right place, with the right measure is a virtue of good men. Now, this is a hot topic word. I understand it's going to be a touchy subject for some, and a lot of people would strongly disagree with me. And that's totally fine. But I believe there are a lot of misconceptions around the word violence, especially in Western culture. And growing up in the United States, I've seen it firsthand and experienced it. From the time you are born until the time you die as a man, at least in this country, you are told by every authority figure, by every piece of government brainwashing, growing up, all you ever hear is violence is something to be avoided at all costs. It is inherently evil. It is unnecessary. It is something you always want to avoid. You can negotiate your way into eternity. You can surrender just about everything, but never, ever, ever touch violence. And that ideology has been primarily a feminine ideology, but hey, we live in a culture where most homes are broken now, or at least 50% of marriages end in divorce, a lot of single mother homes. Most teachers, I want to say 85% or so of all teachers in the public school system are women. And then even in university, most of your teachers are either women or cuckold men or just commies in general, but I could have left that under the same heading, I guess. And so you've got a whole generation or more of men who are being told that violence is something that is evil. You're never supposed to hit. You're never supposed to punch. You're not someone who needs to be strong. You're not someone who needs to be able to bend someone else to your will physically. That is toxic masculinity, and being a soft beta male who agrees with everyone and just talks out everything is, that's the pinnacle of maturity as a man. And I strongly disagree. That's not the way the world works, whether you like it or not. We live in a more primitive world than that. And, especially in the church, and I would say this is something that I believe that Christian men need to embrace in a much greater way. And I will tell you a little story a little later on in this video as to why. But I sincerely believe that one of the reasons we see the world as it is today, we see the problems that we see today, is because most men have lost the ability to apply violence in the right situations. They are not capable of violence, so they are not a threat. And so what we see in the world has been forced upon us because men are no longer seen as a defensive threat. Anyway, so there are a lot of misconceptions around this thing of violence, but I would argue, and I would submit to you to consider throughout this recording, that violence, when controlled and directed with purpose, can actually be a virtue that will protect, serve, and build instead of destroy. So stick with me here and I'll walk you through the why. Now, before we even dive into the why is it virtuous to be violent or to have the capacity for violence, what kind of violence am I talking about here? I think you need to make this distinction, right? There are a couple of definitions when you look up the word violence that are important to know. One is about taking violent, urgent, turbulent action, and by the way, all of us should have that capability. When violent action is needed on our behalf, whether it be in our businesses, in the course of an emergency, you need to carry someone to safety. We all need to be capable of violent action, but the violence that I am talking about today is physical violence. It is the intent to harm someone or stop someone with physical force from causing harm. I am talking about physical violence in this scenario, but I am not talking about unchecked and uncontrolled aggression. All right, to be clear, and I've said it earlier in this recording already, violence is a tool. It's not good or bad, it is a tool. And so if it's a tool, it cannot be our default response to everything. And I want to make clear, especially in speaking to men, that because violent capability is a virtue does not mean that just because you utilize it makes it virtuous. All right? Where you apply it, how you apply it, and the extent to which you apply it is what determines whether it's virtuous or not. You can't just be someone who is angry and starts to hit people. That's not how you get anything done. That's not how you love people. It's not how you protect. Anytime you don't get your way, you don't get to just hit and kick people. You don't get to just punch people into submission. That's not maturity. That's just living in some sort of emotional delusion where you're out of control, and anytime you get angry, you just express it with violence. Now, this is particularly a problem for men, and it's another reason that I believe that violence should be used in the right scenario. It's because too many men, when they engage in violence and they are capable of violence, engage in it in the wrong way. And that's what makes it so dangerous. That's what demonizes it with so many people. So violence is to be a tool, not a default response. So let's make a clear distinction here. We're not talking about just, I'm angry, I'm going to punch people. We're talking about it's a tool in your tool belt. You know how to use it, you know when to use it, you know why to use it. All right? So why is the capacity for violence a virtue? I'm just going to give you three. I could come up with more, but I'll give you three today that you can at least wrap your head around and then begin to employ in your own life. But one, it is for protection of the innocent. Now, growing up, I was born in the Midwest. I was raised, born in Nebraska, raised in Missouri, spent some time overseas, and then I spent a lot of time in Texas. And I was raised in a very, very masculine-dominated home. My parents, my family operated according to a traditional family structure. My dad was the protector and the provider. My mom was the homemaker, the educator, and that's how we operated. And that's how all of the culture I was in operated. It was very male-led. The men were masculine. They were strong. My dad was a wrestler. My dad was a football player. I was one of 5 boys. We were always knocking heads and wrestling and fighting and playing football in the yard. So that physicality was a part of my life. And we always grew up with, my parents were never encouraging us to fight, but my parents were always people who encouraged us to stand up for ourselves. My dad in particular was, he was very much a man's man. And so all the movies we watched, all the TV shows we watched, The Lone Ranger, Roy Rogers, John Wayne, old military movies, World War II stuff, black and whites, didn't matter. Every movie we watched growing up, the books we read, the legendary stories we were told were always about men who were willing to sacrifice themselves and engage in violent action to, keep certain people from being harmed. I'll never forget watching The Magnificent Seven for the first time as a kid with my dad, the original, and just watching these men who were considered everyday outlaws, how they took their skills to go protect a village that was under siege from a gang that they couldn't, resist. And these men stepped in the way to protect the innocent. That's what I grew up on. That was the common sense that I grew up in. And so up until my teen years, I was very much, I'm very clear on this. By the time I hit my teen years, I was living now up in Washington State, Commeyville, Washington, where the vast majority of men are weak, effeminate, they've got boobs, very low T situation up in Washington State on average. Not every man, there's some great men out there that I know, but as a culture, it's very hippied out, very commied out, and it's toxic masculinity for a man to raise his voice, for a man to engage in physical combat, for a man to engage in fighting or aggression of any type. That's toxic. And so I began to really see a lot of this around me, and it really blew my mind because I'm sitting here going, this is such common sense. What happens to the innocent man that is being, or the innocent woman and her children who are being attacked? Shouldn't someone who is good have the capacity to end that situation, to step into that situation, to be able to deter evil at that point? We all are familiar with the phrase at this point that, all it takes for evil to succeed is for good men to do nothing. And it rings true throughout history. It is for protection of the innocent. A capable man is able to shield others from harm. If you are an individual, if you're a man walking around and you don't have the ability to defend your wife and children or defend someone from harm, what good are you really? Think about your purpose. Think about your design. Think about the way God made you. Think about your own, creative design, how God made man. Even just our difference between men and women. Men were built with high testosterone levels. We build muscle really easily. We're typically very black and white. We have this prey drive. We can fast for days at a time and go hungry so we can go hunting. God made us to be able to engage in physical challenge and violent action. That's how men were made. It's a part of our design. And you think about the way God created the male and female dynamic in making the man the protector, the provider, the one who is responsible, and making the woman the helper. It is part of your design to be able to protect the innocent from harm. And I mean, you could think of a million real world examples where, strength and decisiveness prevented greater harm. Every legend you can think of, every great story of any great warrior or man has a killer story of protecting the innocent from harm. So number one is for protecting the innocent. Number two, it builds strength and discipline, right? This whole thing of being violently capable is not just about the end result. More and more as I get older, I understand that phrase. It's not the end of the journey that really becomes the joy. It's the journey itself that becomes the joy. That whole concept of it's not about where you end up, it's what you become along the way. And there is something about becoming capable of physical violence that does something to build you physically and mentally. It forces you to become a disciplined individual. You learn when and how to use force responsibly. It forces you to train for controlled violence, and that builds mental toughness. It builds physical toughness. It builds skills. It builds incredible, processes for deducing when am I supposed to take action. It fosters discipline, self-awareness, and responsibility. And I think another thing that people often miss here, and this is one of the biggest keys here with this whole, it builds strength and discipline. It reflects your creator. Most people won't talk about that. We love to talk about God is love. We love to talk about how gracious and merciful and holy and righteous he is. But go and read the scripture. Go look at who God is. Go look at what people say about what God does to his enemies. Look at what the scripture says about what God does on behalf of the persecuted, on behalf of the widow, on behalf of the orphan, on behalf of the poor. Go look at the action that God took on behalf of his people against their enemies and what he commanded his people to do specifically in the Old Testament to their enemies. God is a warrior. He is powerful. He breaks oaks with his arm. That speaks to something about God. And it's amazing that we want to always take on the other, bits of God's nature and character, whether it be meekness or kindness or patience or self-control. But what about the capacity to inflict harm on those who would inflict harm upon the innocent? How is that not reflecting your creator? And so we've gotten somehow this idea, and I know I'm rabbit holing right now, but bear with me. We've gotten this idea that somehow it is a virtue to be so mild that you don't pose a threat. Meek does not mean weak. Righteous does not mean pushover. There is something about the character of God that as men we have to embrace in knowing that we are protectors and providers made in his image to reflect him. So number two, builds strength and discipline. And number three, it promotes peace through strength. The peace through strength philosophy, it means that simply being capable deters unnecessary aggression. You know it and I know it, but when there is weakness and the bad guy sees weakness, that's what he goes after. Everybody in law enforcement will always tell you, my father-in-law was in law enforcement for a long time. Really smart guy, big dude, super capable, SWAT team, state patrol, all that fun stuff. And every time that we're ever talking about something about security, this one line always comes out of his mouth. He goes, Gabe, all criminals are opportunists. They're all opportunists, right? Evil looks for opportunities to harm the good. Like it or not, that's the world we live in. And actually there was this, and some of you have probably seen this online, but there was an interview done with one of the greatest is a terrible word to use, one of the most prominent, well-known, and successful for his career types for child molesters. One of the biggest child molesters in American history was interviewed about why he chose certain children to go and look to abuse them. And he said, what I would do in any situation, he said, was I would always look at the father. If the father did not pose a threat, I would go after that child. And it didn't matter if it was a boy, girl, it didn't matter what the ages were. But by looking at the father, he determined whether or not it was worth it to pursue that child who was his target. And for men who were present, for men who were alert, for men who were aware, for men who looked capable, for men who looked like a threat, those were the children he avoided because he knew that their father could cause him harm. So, 1, protection of the innocent. 2, it builds strength and discipline. And 3, it promotes peace through strength. Sometimes being violently capable, and quite honestly, I think it's the biggest tool in the tool bag of being violently capable, is the fact that you can deter things from even escalating. That is massive, man. I mean, think about it. If you're somebody who is in a particular place, someone's looking for trouble, and you look like someone who is capable, you've been hitting your weights, you know where you're supposed to stand, you know your position, you're sober, you've thought ahead of time, you are skilled, you are ready, that puts you in a much better position in those situations. But when someone's looking for a target and you don't look like an easy target, that's an easy way to use violence on your behalf without even lifting a finger. You haven't even had to apply it, and it's already working on your behalf. All right, so practical applications. How do we actually apply this to our life? These are just 3 ways you can do it. Number 1, develop physical strength and skill. You actually have to spend the time to become physically capable of being violent and applying violence in the right way. That can look like training in martial arts. It could look like boxing. It could look like self-defense or weapons handling. But practically speaking, if you run into a situation where it's going to be required, you would better know what you're going to do. You'd better know what you're doing. You'd better not only have the physical skills, as in the ability to put something on a target multiple times in the same place on the move, you also need to be able to, with your hands, apply violence in the right way. You need to not only have the skill and the knowledge, you need to have the physical capability. That means staying fit, staying in shape, keeping your weight down, staying muscular, lifting weights on a regular basis, understanding how to throw yourself around. Can you run a mile? Can you carry someone else for a mile? What are you capable of? So number 1, develop the physical strength and skill. That'll also do incredible stuff to your mental game as well. And that's number 2, is cultivate mental discipline. And this is probably the most important aspect of your ability to apply violence in the right way. It's great to have the physical skill. It's great to have the physical capability. But if you don't use your head and keep it on you and keep your cool along the way, you're going to apply this in the wrong way. It's going to get you into a lot of trouble. By the way, this video, as a disclaimer, is not an instruction to go and harm anyone. It is definitely a call to action to get yourself in a position where you can defend the defenseless. But cultivate that mental discipline. Learn when and how to use force responsibly. Part of this is going to be study. Part of it might be reading or YouTubing or taking a course. I take courses from people all the time that are teaching me about firearms and how to not only inflict harm, but how to dress wounds, how to do first aid. I'm not just playing with the apply violence aspect of this. I'm using it, or I'm studying to be able to help those who have already been harmed. But work on that mental discipline. Knowing when and how to use that force will get you out of a lot of trouble and keep you out of a lot of dangerous situations. It will also teach you how to keep emotions in check in times of conflict. Now, I talked about this on one of the videos I just recorded and released recently about negotiating conflict with your spouse, with your wife, right? This whole thing about emotional control is the most vital part, right? Not only do you have to know what's going on mentally and be able to process it and already have some options thought out because you've been through this scenario before, you've also got to learn to keep your emotions in check so you're not acting out of anger. While we're acting violently, we still want to do it righteously and in the right way. When your emotions are leading, you're generally not thinking with your head and you're not usually being led by your moral compass. But then also within that cultivating mental discipline is knowing when violence is justified and when it's not. Guys, not everything, not every situation requires a beating. Not every time someone says something to your wife that is offensive demands a fight. As a matter of fact, guys, words don't really bother me all that much. Some of you may not like it, but I'm not going to go and get into a physical altercation with someone because of the words that they say. It's not worth it. 1, you never know who you're fighting. 2, you don't know what lengths other people will go to. And if some guy wants to say something about my wife or look at my wife walking down the street or even say something, do you think I'm going to go to jail or a hospital over that issue? No, I'm not going to waste my time on it. And I don't care if you say I'm not a man because of it. It doesn't matter. My kids and my wife would rather me end up at home rather than letting some words that don't actually do any physical harm get me to a place of applying violence in the wrong way and ending up in trouble. So anyway, number 2 is cultivate that mental discipline. And number 3 is create boundaries. And this is preemptive. This is something you can do before you even get to that scenario. It's beyond the training physically. It's beyond the training mentally. We're just talking about creating boundaries. And that simply means to know how you will respond ahead of time. Knowing your limits ahead of time. You know, there's a lot of people that will not know where their line is. And then all of a sudden, the decision, that moment of decision will be thrust upon them, and they won't know how to act because they've never considered where they are in that moment. They've never considered the situation they're in. They've never considered this context. Oh man, you know, I've always said I would stand up for myself. I would stand up for my children. I would stand up for what is right. But they've never thought about where their line actually is. They always talk about better not cross that line, but how many of you actually know what your line is? Back in 2020 was when I really woke up to my own need to be more violently capable. I was always, you know, into fitness and lifting weights, and you know, as a general rule, I don't think a lot of people saw me as an easy target. But when 2020 rolled around and I had to choose my line and go, hold on a second. My line is if someone comes to my home and asks to see my children and ask them about their vaccine status, that is my line. And that is the switch that will be thrown when all hell is unleashed on my front porch. That was my line. I had to determine what it was going to be. Know ahead of time what your line is going to be. Know what you are going to do when the doo-doo hits the fan. Know what your plan is to act when acting is required. Because there will be times when action is required, and no amount of talking, negotiating, or trying to get along is going to make it work. Now, how do we balance virtue and violence? Guys, there is a danger of unchecked aggression. And there is a major line between capability and abuse of power. I think a lot of people have probably seen Jordan Peterson's talk on it. I love his thoughts on it. I don't necessarily love listening to Peterson, but you know, I do think he has great thoughts on this. He's like, I think his statement is something to the effect of, a man who is not capable of violence and is peaceful is not virtuous. If the man has no capability to act violently, then it's not virtuous for him to be peaceful. He has no other option. What is truly virtuous is for a man who can cause extreme harm to not do so and to choose peace as an option. That is what true virtue is. It's someone who has the ability to harm and chooses not to. That's virtuous. And so there is a line between capability and abuse of power. Just because you're capable doesn't mean you should. Just because you can doesn't make it right. Just because that other person is a bad guy also doesn't make it right. So there is a line between capability and abuse of power, and you need to know that line. And that's why control is essential for maintaining virtue. You've got to remain a controlled individual. And then two, I think violence, you know, at the very beginning, I was talking about how some people they'll say that violence is never an option. It's completely unnecessary. You need to avoid it at all costs. Now, the danger there is that some people will keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And if you keep giving up more and more ground, they know that you're going to keep giving up more ground, so they just keep pushing, and it gets worse and worse. They just keep appeasing. They just keep saying, okay, I'll give a little more ground, I'll give a little more ground, I'll give a little more ground, and sooner or later they're backed into a corner because they wouldn't stand up earlier, all right? And so that whole thing of avoidance, I don't agree with. But violence as a last resort, I think, is probably a pretty good rule to follow. I would rather not utilize it if I don't have to. I would like to avoid it. I would like to not go to jail, even if I go, you know, when I'm in the right. But it happens every single day. People can be doing the right thing in the right place at the right time, and they can still end up in jail on the other side of the law. And so this whole violence as a last resort is a good rule. You should be able to negotiate. You should be able to use your words to solve situations in any way, you know, in any given situation. Where it's possible, you should be able to work things out with people. You know, this whole violence thing, again, it is a tool for the right time. You don't whip out a screwdriver, but there are moments when it comes when you must be able and willing to utilize it in the right way. So exhaust those peaceful options before resorting to force. Do whatever it takes to avoid going there. But when you go there, go all the way. When you go there, demolish evil. When you go there, leave no doubt. When you go there, have no mercy. When that switch has to get flipped and you know where it is and you know you are in the right, You know your moral compass is telling you the right thing to do. You know you are defending the weak and the innocent and the helpless from those who would harm them. Go and be ruthless. Take off the enemy's head. If you don't like the way I put it, go and read the scripture. Go and look at almost every single Old Testament hero there is. These were men of war. These were men that could sling stones with either hand. They were men who plunged swords into others. These were men who had no qualms about taking the head off of a giant or off of an enemy that was looking to harm their people. It's a virtue that has been lost, and it's a virtue that needs to be regained. And if you don't like where this country is right now, if you don't like where your nation is right now, look no further than the citizens, specifically the men that inhabit your nation. There's a reason certain people don't approach my children. It's because they see me in the way. There's a reason they don't come through the house. They see me in the way. And they see the sign on my door that says I don't call 911. Those are called deterrents. If you had a greater group of men in your nation or in your neighborhood, how comfortable do you think evil would be trying to impose its will on you, your family, and your community? When men are weak, evil prevails. When men are perceived as weak, the enemy encroaches. It's that constant thing of if it sees no threat, it's going to encroach on your territory. You, the men around you, need to get this as a tool in your tool belt. You need to become violently capable and violently skilled. And Christian men in particular need to wake up to this fact. I got a sister that's living right now in South Africa. And her and her husband live just up the street from a city. A couple of years ago, there were a lot of riots going on where a lot of people were coming out of the city into the farmland, killing and raping the farmers and their families, taking over their farms, stealing everything. And I asked my sister, I said, why has your land not been touched yet? Because they're just right up the road from this. Their land should have been taken over. They should have been harmed. They likely would have been. But she said, thank God for the Muslims up the street. Because when the government said to turn in your weapons, they refused to. And so they're up the hill with all these guns that the government says are illegal, and yet it's the one thing that are keeping all these people from down in the cities from coming up and burning our place down. That's something where I have more respect for the Muslim men in the Muslim community than I do for the Christian community. Because at least Muslim men will stand up for their community in the real world. And this whole thing of, we just pray and we hope that God will take care of it, ain't enough. You still have a job to do. You are a man. You are the protector. You are the provider. You are called to be a warrior in your home. You can't shirk that responsibility because it's easier to say, I'll pray about it and God willing. That is some pussed out nonsense. And it's time for men, specifically God-fearing men, to reflect the nature of their Creator as the warriors, the protectors, the fighters that they were made to be in the image of God. Guys, embrace your capability, embrace your design, embrace your calling to reflect your Creator, and develop those skills of violence. I encourage you to develop that capacity to act when needed, but to cultivate the wisdom to know when to do so and when to do it in the right way. The man who is capable of violence but chooses peace is the man the world needs most. Hope this episode was awesome for you. Share it with a friend. Let me know what you think in the comments. Stay tuned for the next one.